That was their last mistake.
Target destroyed.
Their shields stopped energy, but nothing stops 2 tons of metal moving at near light speed.
Break their backs.
They thought we were just another prey species hiding in the dark. They didn't know our silence wasn't fear, it was a slumber. When the dying broadcast breached our borders, the hunters expected a whimper. Instead, they woke the shipyard. And humanity was very, very hungry for a fight. Atticus breathed in. The air tasted like pennies and burnt ozone. It always did on the graveyard shift aboard Orbital Relay Station, Archimedes. He sat slumped in a synthetic leather chair that had lost its padding a decade ago, staring at a bank of monitors coated in a thin film of greasy dust. The hum of the station's life support scrubbers was a constant, oppressive vibration that traveled up through the rubber soles of his boots and settled in his lower back as a dull ache. He rubbed his eyes. His fingers smelled of cheap filter coffee and the metallic tang of the console. It was 0340 hours. Atticus was 52, functionally divorced, and currently assigned to the most useless patch of deep space real estate in the United Terran Alliance. His job was to listen to the void. The void, historically, had nothing to say. He reached for his mug, feeling the cold ceramic against his palm, and took a sip. The coffee was lukewarm and gritty. He swallowed it anyway. Then, the console spat out a sound. It wasn't the rhythmic, polite chime of a scheduled automated freighter broadcast. It was a violent burst of static that tore through his headset, driving a spike of pain directly into his eardrums. Atticus winced, violently jerking his head to the side, spilling half his coffee down the front of his uniform shirt. The liquid was sticky and immediately uncomfortable against his skin. "Christ," he muttered, fumbling for the volume dial. He dragged the slider down, his fingers leaving a smear of coffee on the plastic panel. The static didn't stop. It resolved into a chaotic, overlapping mess of audio. Atticus leaned closer, his annoyance bleeding out, replaced by a sudden, heavy coldness in his gut. He didn't want to hear this. Every instinct in his tired, bureaucratic brain told him to log it as a solar flare anomaly and delete the buffer. He knew what dying sounded like. He had served in the border skirmishes 20 years ago. He knew the wet, panicked gurgle of a punctured lung over a comms channel. He didn't want it in his head again, but his hand, almost against his will, tapped the decoding matrix. The translation software chewed on the signal. The screen flickered, projecting jagged green waveforms. Crack. Hiss. Hull breach on. Sectors 4 through 9. They are inside. Oh gods. They are inside. The voice was high-pitched, harmonic, like a chorus of glass flutes shattering against a brick wall. It wasn't human, but the terror in it was universally legible. Behind the voice, Atticus heard the background noise. It was the sound of a slaughter. He heard the deep, concussive thuds of heavy impacts against metal. He heard the tearing of alloys, and he heard screams. Dozens of them. They sounded like birds being crushed under heavy boots. "Please," the voice begged. The translation software rendering the alien syntax into flat, automated Terran standard, stripping it of inflection, but unable to hide the raw, trembling cadence. "This is the civilian refuge vessel, Song of the Reed. We are unarmed. We have 1,000,000 souls in cryo-transit. The Vraks, they are burning the pods. They are just burning them. If anyone is out there in the dark, if anyone can hear us, we are dying. We are." A wet crunch cut the transmission. Then, a new sound bled through the static. A low, guttural chittering. A laugh. It was a thick, wet sound, heavy with malice. The channel went dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the static. Atticus sat frozen. The spilled coffee was seeping through his shirt, cold against his ribs. His heart was hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his sternum. He felt nauseous. The acid from the cheap coffee clawed at the back of his throat. He stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. The log demanded an input tag. Anomaly. Tag. Junk. Tag. Distress. If he tagged it distress, it went up the chain. It meant waking up the captain. It meant paperwork. It meant pulling the Terran Alliance out of its comfortable isolationist shell and dragging it into someone else's bloodbath. Atticus's hand shook as he hovered over the keypad. He was just a comms jockey. He didn't want to be responsible for the avalanche this would cause. The universe was a dark forest, and humanity had learned the hard way to keep its fires banked and its head down. He squeezed his eyes shut. He heard that wet crunch again in his mind. He heard the arrogant, guttural laugh of a predator that thought it owned the dark. Atticus opened his eyes. He swallowed the bile in his throat, his jaw setting into a hard, rigid line. "Idiots," he whispered to the empty room, aiming the insult at the unknown aggressors. "You just had to make a noise." He slammed his fist down on the yellow key. Tag. Distress, critical, hostile action. The console chirped. The signal was sent up the chain. Atticus slumped back in his ruined chair, wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. The die was cast. The command deck of the Archimedes smelled like floor wax and old sweat. Captain Miller looked like a man who had been dragged out of a deep sleep by his ankles. His uniform jacket was unbuttoned, and his graying hair stuck up at odd angles. He stood over the holotable, his heavy hands planted firmly on the metal rim. "Play it again, Gibson," Miller said. His voice was gravelly, thick with sleep and irritation. Atticus stood in the corner. He had changed his shirt, but he could still feel the phantom chill of the spill. Beside, the captain stood Admiral Hayes, a hologram projected from Fleet Command on Earth. The hologram flickered slightly, casting a pale blue light over the grim faces in the room. Hayes was a woman made of sharp angles and pragmatism, her eyes hidden in the shadows of her brow. Atticus hit the playback. The screams filled the command deck. The tearing metal. The desperate, harmonic begging. And finally, that wet, guttural laugh. Miller's jaw muscle jumped. He didn't say anything until the recording ended. He just stared at the empty space above the projector. "The Vrax," Hayes said, her voice filtered through the encrypted channel. It sounded thin, like dry leaves. "We've monitored their expansion, a hyper-aggressive, territorial species. They use plasma-based weaponry, energy shielding. They consider themselves the apex predators of this galactic arm. They're burning civilian cryopods, Admiral," Miller said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded tired. It was the exhaustion of a man, realizing that peace was a fragile illusion that had just shattered. "I heard the recording, Captain," Hayes replied coldly. "So, what do we do?" Atticus asked. He hadn't meant to speak. The words just slipped out. Both officers turned to him. Atticus felt a flush of heat in his cheeks, but he held his ground. "Sir, ma'am, we can't just log it and ignore it." I heard that laugh. "They aren't doing it for resources. They're doing it because they enjoy it." Hayes sighed. It was a long, heavy sound. "Mr. Gibson is right, but not for the reasons of altruism. If the Vrax are pushing into the Kalen sector, they are 3 parsecs from the Orion frontier. If they wipe out the Kalen, we are next. They don't know we're here," Miller pointed out. "We run silent." "They will find us eventually," Hayes countered. "And I would rather meet a bully in the street than wait for him to kick down my front door." She paused. The hologram flickered. "The Terran Parliament has been looking for a reason to justify the defense budget. It seems the universe has provided one. You want to deploy the fleet." Miller stated it as a fact, not a question. "I want to send a message," Hayes corrected. "A very loud one. Over the next 12 hours, the Archimedes became the nerve center for an awakening giant." Atticus didn't sleep. He sat at his console, guzzling synthetic stimulants that tasted like battery acid, routing encrypted orders from Earth out to the hidden shipyards in the asteroid belts and the gas giant moons. It was a terrifying thing to witness. Humanity hadn't fought a major war in 80 years. They had spent that time building, hiding, perfecting the art of kinetic violence while the rest of the galaxy played with elegant, fragile energy weapons. Atticus listened to the comms chatter as the deep space dreadnoughts powered up. It wasn't the clean, silent hum of alien vessels. It was raw, mechanical brutality. He could almost smell the burning dust off the massive fusion drives. Through the telemetry, He watched the power spikes as gravity dampeners, neglected for decades, whined and struggled to contain the massive ships that were essentially flying bricks of depleted uranium and titanium armor. He heard the voices of the captains checking in. They didn't sound heroic. They sounded like mechanics who had just been told to grab their crowbars. There was a cynical, blue-collar grimness to the Terran fleet. "This is the UNS Hammerhead. Reactor is hot. We got 3 loose bulkheads, and the coffee machine is busted, but the railguns are green. UNS Goliath checking in. Spooled and ready. Tell command my port thruster still pulls left, but we'll manage." It wasn't a sleek armada of polished knights. It was a rusted, heavy-duty demolition crew waking up from a hangover. By hour 18, the vanguard was assembled. 40 dreadnoughts, 100 frigates, all clustered at the edge of the system, their massive Alcubierre drives spinning up. The sheer gravitational distortion of their engines caused the Archimedes to shudder violently. Atticus gripped the edges of his console, feeling the vibrations rattle his teeth. The air pressure in the room dropped. The fluorescent lights flickered and dimmed, struggling against the massive power draw. "Jump coordinates locked," Miller announced, his hands gripping the railing of the command deck. He looked at Atticus. "Transmit the final telemetry, Gibson. Let's go see what the dark is hiding." Atticus keyed the sequence. "May God have mercy on the bastards," he muttered. Space tore open. It didn't glide. It ripped, like a heavy canvas sheet being torn down the middle by a meat hook. The fleet vanished, leaving nothing behind, but an afterimage burned into Atticus's retinas and the smell of ozone thick enough to choke on. The transition back to real space was never graceful. For Atticus, who had begged a transfer to the dreadnought UNS Bellerophon to act as fleet comms liaison, it felt like his internal organs had been put in a blender, frozen, and then violently thawed. He gripped the edges of his tactical station, his knuckles white. The gravity dampeners failed for a microsecond as the ship ripped its way out of the slipspace tear. For that split second, Atticus felt the blood rush to the back of his skull, a crushing weight pressing against his eyeballs. He grabbed the plastic biobag taped to the side of his console and vomited. It was a sour, burning mix of stomach acid and stale coffee. He wiped his mouth with the back of a trembling hand, gasping for air. The ship's internal klaxons were blaring a rhythmic, grating womp 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 that vibrated deep in his chest. The air smelled of overheated copper wiring and the sharp, chemical tang of hyperpropellant. "Report!" Captain Cole bellowed from the center chair. Cole was a massive man, his uniform straining at the shoulders, his face a mask of brutal focus. "Sensors stabilizing," Atticus croaked, his throat burning. He slapped his hand against the console, clearing the diagnostic screens. The tactical map flooded with data. It was a slaughterhouse. The Kalen system was bathed in the harsh, dying light of a red dwarf star. Against the void, Atticus saw the debris field. Millions of jagged metal shards, glowing with residual heat. The Kalen ships, if you could call them that, were beautiful, fragile things, curved hulls of spun glass and light composites. They were being torn to pieces. The Vrax fleet hung above the planet like a swarm of fat, armored beetles. Their ships were sleek, pulsating with a sickly purple energy shield. As Atticus watched the feed, a Vrax cruiser unleashed a torrent of plasma. The superheated gas melted straight through a fleeing Kalen transport, cleanly cutting the ship in half. The transport's atmosphere vented into space, instantly freezing into a cloud of sparkling ice. There were no distress calls anymore, just the agonizing silence of the dead. "Target-rich environment," the weapons officer, a pale kid named Jenkins, said. His voice cracked slightly. He wasn't smiling. His hands were flying over the targeting matrices. The Vrax hadn't noticed them yet. The human fleet had dropped out of slipspace on the dark side of a gas giant, masked by its radiation belts. They were 40 dreadnoughts, ugly and blocky. They had no sleek curves. They were built to take a beating and deliver a worse one. "Open a wideband channel," Cole ordered, his eyes locked on the main viewer. Unencrypted, Atticus complied, his fingers slipping slightly on the keys. "Channel open, sir." Cole didn't offer a declaration of war. He didn't offer a chance for surrender. He looked at the massacre on the screen, the burning civilian pods, and the sheer arrogance of the Vrax formation. "This is the United Terran Alliance," Cole said, his voice flat, devoid of any theatricality. "You are in violation of basic sentient rights. You have 60 seconds to power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded." Atticus watched the Vrax fleet on the tactical display. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then, the guttural, wet chittering returned. It flooded the comms channel. It was the same laugh Atticus had heard on the SOS. They found the warning amusing. 3 of their cruisers lazily broke formation, turning their prows toward the human fleet, charging their plasma batteries. Cole didn't blink. He just leaned back in his chair. The metal groaned under his weight. "Jenkins," Cole said quietly, "Seer, show them what a kinetic impact looks like. Firing main batteries." The Bellerophon didn't shoot a laser. It didn't fire a bolt of plasma. It fired a 2-ton slug of depleted uranium, magnetically accelerated along a barrel the length of a skyscraper to a fraction of the speed of light. The recoil shook the entire dreadnought. Atticus was thrown violently against his harness, his teeth clacking together. The sound wasn't a pew. It was a deafening, structural crack that resonated through the deck plates, followed by the deep, terrifying roar of the massive autoloader, shoving the next shell into the breach. On the screen, the lead Vrax cruiser, confident in its energy shields, took the hit dead center. Alien energy shields were designed to dissipate heat. They were designed to scatter plasma and refract lasers. They were absolutely not designed to stop 2 tons of solid matter moving at 100,000 kilometers a second. The slug punched through the purple shield like a bullet through wet paper. It didn't stop. It slammed into the sleek, armored hull of the Vrax cruiser. The kinetic energy transfer was catastrophic. The alien ship didn't explode. It simply shattered. It crumpled inward, buckling under the sheer blunt force trauma, before the internal reactors breached, vaporizing the vessel from the inside out in a silent flash of white light. The laugh on the comms channel abruptly cut off. "Target destroyed," Jenkins reported, his voice flat, though Atticus could see a bead of sweat tracing down his neck. Cole nodded. "Fleet-wide order. Weapons free. Break their backs." The human fleet opened up. Atticus watched in a state of horrified awe. The void was suddenly filled with the invisible, deadly paths of thousands of kinetic slugs. The human ships didn't bother with elegant maneuvers. They formed a brutal, overlapping wall of iron and pushed forward. The Vrax panicked. Their sensors, calibrated for energy spikes, couldn't track the incoming solid projectiles until it was too late. Cruisers were cored out, their beautiful hulls ripped to shreds by armor-piercing rounds. The alien plasma fire splashed harmlessly against the thick, ablative titanium armor of the Terran dreadnoughts, scorching the paint but doing little else. It wasn't a battle. It was an extermination. The Vrax had brought scalpels to a fight. Humanity had brought sledgehammers. Atticus listened to the tactical chatter. It was chaotic, loud, and entirely devoid of mercy. "Focus fire on the dreadnoughts. Crack their engines. Leave them dead in the water. Hull breach on deck 4, seal it off and keep firing. I want that frigate turned into scrap." The smell of vomit in Atticus's biobag mingled with the scent of ozone and the acrid smoke wafting from an overloaded capacitor behind his chair. He was terrified. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely type. But as he watched the Vrax fleet break and attempt to flee only to be cut down by a relentless hail of missiles and slugs, he felt a dark, primal satisfaction settle in his gut. They had woken the graveyard. And the dead didn't know how to stop. The orbital bombardment didn't end with a dramatic crescendo. It stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. The Bellerophon groaned, the massive structural support settling after bleeding off millions of tons of kinetic recoil. The tactical map, previously swarming with red hostile markers, was now mostly gray dust. Only a handful of Vrax signatures remained, clustered like parasites against the massive, elegant hull of the Song of the Reed. Atticus was still staring at his screen, his breathing shallow. He felt numb. The smell of the overloaded capacitor behind him had permeated his uniform, leaving a bitter taste on his tongue. "Main batteries cooling," Jenkins reported, his voice hollow. "Enemy fleet is gone, sir. Just debris and escaping life pods." Captain Cole didn't celebrate. He rubbed his thick jaw, staring at the Kalen refugee ship. The civilian vessel was adrift, its glass-like hull scarred with jagged black plasma burns. "Target the life pods," Cole said. Atticus's head snapped up. He looked at the captain, his stomach twisting. "Sir?" "They were burning civilian cryopods, Gibson," Cole replied, his voice devoid of anger, which somehow made it worse. It was pure, utilitarian math. "I don't leave loose ends, and I don't give quarter to butchers. Jenkins, sweep the trash." "Ah, yeah, sir." Atticus watched the auxiliary cannons light up on the telemetry feed. He closed his eyes as the small, defenseless escape pods were vaporized into expanding clouds of atomic dust. He hated it. He hated the cold logic of it. But when he remembered the harmonic, begging voice on the SOS, a dark, ugly part of him felt that the scales were just balancing out. "We have a problem," the tactical officer called out. "The remaining Vrax boarding parties are still inside the Song of the Reed. They aren't retreating. They're accelerating the purge. The Kalen life support network is collapsing. We can't hit them with ship-to-ship weapons without cracking the civilian vessel." Cole stood up, the metal decking groaning under his boots. "Launch the Marines. I want that ship secured 10 minutes ago. Gibson, you're going with them." Atticus froze. His hands, still resting on his keyboard, went completely cold. "Me? Sir, I'm a comms liaison. I haven't held a rifle since the border skirmishes." "I don't need you to shoot, Gibson. I need you to talk to the Kalen mainframe," Cole said, turning his heavy gaze on him. "Their network syntax is completely alien, and their life support is failing. The Marines don't know how to bypass a multi-tier decryption matrix. You do. Grab a vest. Now." 10 minutes later, Atticus was strapped into a drop shuttle. The air inside the troop compartment was freezing, smelling sharply of gun oil, sweat, and the sour tang of adrenaline. 10 heavily armored Marines sat in 2 rows, facing each other. They looked less like soldiers and more like walking tanks. Their armor was bulky, scarred, and painted a flat, light-absorbing black. They carried heavy assault rifles that fired caseless, armor-piercing sabots. Sitting across from Atticus was Sergeant Gallagher. The man had a face like a ruined quarry, deeply lined and expressionless. He was methodically checking the seals on his helmet, his massive gauntlets moving with surprising dexterity. "Don't throw up on my deck, Gibson," Gallagher said over the internal comms, his voice a low rumble. "Stay behind the heavy shields. If a Vrax looks at you, drop to the deck and pray to whatever god you like. We'll handle the rest." Atticus nodded mutely. The heavy ceramic trauma plate strapped over his chest felt like a tombstone. His knees were shaking, a rapid, uncontrollable tremor that rattled the buckles of his harness. With a violent lurch, the shuttle decoupled. The ride was mercifully short, but brutal. The magnetic clamps engaged with a bone-jarring clang against the Kalen ship's hull. Sparks showered the viewport as the breaching ring melted through the spun glass composite. "Breach?" Gallagher barked. The airlock doors blew inward. The Marines moved. They didn't charge with battle cries. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Atticus stumbled out behind them, gasping as the atmosphere of the alien ship hit his lungs. It smelled like burnt sugar and rotting meat. The corridor was a masterpiece of alien architecture, all sweeping curves and pale, luminescent panels. Or it had been. Now, it was a slaughterhouse. The walls were scorched black. Mangled bodies of the Kalen slender, multi-limbed creatures with translucent skin were strewn across the deck. They had been cut down while running. Atticus gagged, pressing his hand over his mouth. He slipped on a patch of viscous blue fluid, his boots sliding out from under him. A massive hand grabbed his shoulder harness, hauling him upright. "Keep moving," Gallagher growled, pushing him forward. Up ahead, the corridor opened into a massive atrium. That was where they found the Vrax. They were huge, towering over even the armored human Marines. They had segmented, insectoid armor that gleamed with a sickening violet iridescence, and their mandibles clacked with that same wet, guttural sound Atticus had heard on the recording. They were currently standing over a row of sealed, crystalline tubes, pressing plasma torches against the glass. Inside the tubes, Kalen's civilians writhed as the heat began to boil their cryofluid. "Contact!" Corporal Ruiz yelled. The Vraks turned, raising their plasma casters. But they were slow. They were used to fighting prey. They were used to victims who cowered behind failing energy shields. The human Marines didn't use energy shields. They used mass, momentum, and extreme violence. The enclosed space erupted into a deafening roar. Atticus dropped to the deck, clapping his hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut as the muzzle flashes strobed the corridor in blinding white light. The sound of human kinetic weapons in close quarters was physical. It punched the air out of Atticus's lungs. He opened his eyes just in time to see a Vraks warrior take a concentrated burst from Gallagher's heavy rifle. The Vraks' personal energy shield flared purple for a fraction of a second before the armor-piercing sabots shattered it. The rounds tore into the alien's thorax. Pale, glowing blood sprayed in a wide arc, painting the pristine, curved walls. The Vraks let out a shrieking, harmonic click and fell backward, its torso essentially hollowed out. But they weren't defenseless. A searing bolt of plasma hissed over Atticus's head, radiating a heat so intense it singed his eyebrows. It struck Corporal Ruiz squarely in the chest plate. Ruiz was thrown backward, slamming into a bulkhead. The plasma splashed against the ablative ceramic, instantly turning it to white-hot slag. The air filled with the horrific smell of melting composite and burning flesh. "Man down!" someone yelled, but the fire didn't stop. The Marines simply stepped over Ruiz, pouring an unrelenting stream of lead into the atrium. Within 30 seconds, the firefight was over. 5 Vraks lay dead, their bodies torn to pieces. Gallagher didn't hesitate. He kicked a twitching Vrak's limb out of the way and pointed to a glowing console at the center of the room. "Gibson, get up! Stop the purge!" Atticus scrambled to his feet, his boots slipping in the mix of blue and glowing white blood. He ran to the console. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped his datapad. He cursed, snatched it up, and slammed the hardline cable into the Kalen port. The screen flashed alien syntax, rapidly scrolling red. "They've initiated a cascading thermal overload," Atticus yelled over his shoulder, his fingers finally finding the keys, fueled by pure, terrifying adrenaline. "They're trying to boil the whole bay." "Stop it!" Gallagher demanded, kneeling beside Ruiz and jamming a coagulant foam injector into the Marine's ruined chest plate. Ruiz was screaming, a wet, ragged sound. Atticus stared at the code. It was beautiful, complex, like a symphony. And the Vraks had just taken a meat cleaver to it. He couldn't bypass it. The encryption was a biometric lock, requiring a Kalen neural signature. "I can't slice it." Atticus panicked, his breathing shallow. "It's hard-locked to their biology. Find a way, or 1,000 people burn in the next minute," Gallagher roared. Atticus looked around desperately. He looked at the mangled bodies of the Kalen on the floor. He looked at the console. He looked at the Vraks' plasma torches lying on the deck. "Screw elegance," Atticus muttered. He grabbed the heavy, metal butt of his unslung sidearm and smashed it directly into the console's primary biometric interface. The glass shattered. Sparks showered over his hands, burning his knuckles. He dug his fingers into the wiring, grabbing the primary thermal regulation bus, the thickest cluster of blue cables, and physically ripped it out of the board. The console sparked, screeched, and went black. In the cryotubes, the boiling fluid immediately ceased bubbling. The ambient temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in 5 seconds. Atticus collapsed back onto the deck, his chest heaving, his hands bleeding from the glass. He smelled his own burnt skin. "Status?" Gallagher asked, panting heavily. "Hard reset," Atticus croaked. "Manual override. They're safe. The freezing process is stabilizing." The atrium fell silent, save for the ragged breathing of Corporal Ruiz and the hiss of escaping steam. Atticus sat in a puddle of alien blood, looking at the destruction. This wasn't a heroic rescue. It was a messy, brutal alleyway mugging on a cosmic scale. And humanity was the thug holding the bloody pipe. It took 3 hours to secure the rest of the Song of the Reed. The remaining Vraks fought to the death, unable to comprehend that they were being outmatched by creatures without personal shielding. The human Marines obliged them, clearing room by room with shotguns, frag grenades, and brutal efficiency. Atticus stayed in the atrium, wrapping his bleeding hands in sterile gauze from a medkit Gallagher had tossed him. Ruiz had been medevaced back to the Bellerophon, alive but missing a lung. The silence that settled over the ship was heavier than the noise of the battle. Atticus stood before the central cluster of cryopods. With the threat neutralized, he had managed to patch his datapad into an auxiliary terminal, slowly running the wake-up protocols. The ice on the glass tubes began to melt, dripping onto the deck with quiet, rhythmic splashes. The first pod hissed open. A thick cloud of white vapor spilled out, curling around Atticus's boots. From the mist, a figure stumbled forward, collapsing to its knees. It was a Kaelin. Up close, they were breathtakingly fragile. It stood about 7 feet tall, with 4 slender arms ending in long, delicate digits. Its skin was translucent, shimmering like opal in the dim emergency lighting. It wore a simple, flowing garment made of a material that looked like woven light. Atticus stepped forward slowly, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. The translation software in his earpiece hummed to life. The Kaelin looked up. Its eyes were large, entirely black, reflecting the carnage of the room. It looked at the shredded, bloody remains of the Vrax warriors. It looked at the scorch marks on the pristine walls. Then, it looked at Atticus. Atticus knew what he looked like. He was an aging, heavy-set man in a dark, utilitarian uniform, stained with coffee, sweat, and alien blood. Standing behind him were 3 human Marines, their armor scarred, their visors opaque, holding weapons that looked like they belonged on heavy machinery, not in the hands of sentient beings. "You," the Kaelin spoke. The voice was the same harmonic, flute-like sound from the distress call, though the translator flattened it into Terran Standard. "You are the ones who answered." "We heard your signal," Atticus said softly. His throat was dry. "I'm Atticus Gibson, United Terran Alliance. You're safe now. The Vrax are dead." The Kaelin didn't look relieved. It looked horrified. It slowly pushed itself up using 2 of its hands, trembling violently. It gestured toward the pulverized corpse of a Vrax commander. "They were the Apex," the Kaelin whispered. "They have burned 50 systems. Their shields, their armor. Nothing could break them." The alien took a step back, shrinking away from Gallagher, who was standing perfectly still like a shadowed gargoyle. "What are you?" Atticus felt a knot form in his stomach. He saw the terror in the alien's black eyes. It wasn't the terror of prey looking at a predator. It was the terror of a victim who had just watched a wolf be casually torn apart by a bear. "We're just the neighbors," Atticus said, though the joke fell flat, turning into ash in his mouth. "You use kinetics," the Kaelin said, its translator struggling to convey the utter disbelief. "Solid matter. Explosives. You fight like primitive beasts. You have no elegance. You just break things." "Yeah," Atticus agreed, looking down at his bandaged, trembling hands. "We're not very elegant, but we're very good at breaking things that need breaking." The Kaelin looked around the atrium again. It saw the hundreds of intact cryopods, the millions of lives saved by the brutal intervention. The alien bowed its head. A gesture of submission or gratitude Atticus couldn't tell. "We owe you our survival, Terrans," the Kaelin said softly. "But I fear for the galaxy. You have slaughtered the hunters, but in doing so, you have shown us that a much, much darker monster was sleeping in the void." Atticus didn't have an answer for that. He just turned away, gesturing for the Marines to start organizing the evacuation lines. 6 hours later, Atticus was back in his seat on the Bellerophon. The ship smelled like ozone and antiseptic. The Kaelin refugees had been transferred to the cavernous cargo bays of the human dreadnoughts, isolated from the military crew. Captain Cole sat in his command chair, looking over the final casualty reports. 22 Marines dead, 40 wounded. 1 dreadnought took structural damage from a suicide ramming. Acceptable losses. Acceptable. The word rattled in Atticus's exhausted brain. "Fleet is realigned, Captain. Jenkins reported. Slipspace drive spooling up. Good, Cole said. He looked at the main viewer. The Kalen system was empty now, save for the debris of the Vrax fleet and the drifting, dead husk of the Song of the Reed. Gibson, open a wideband channel across the sector network. Maximum gain. Let it bounce off every relay from here to the galactic core. Atticus typed the commands, his bandaged fingers clumsy on the keys. Channel open, sir. Cole leaned forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. To any listening entity. This is Captain Cole of the United Terran Alliance. We claimed a patch of dark, and we stayed quiet. We wanted to be left alone. He paused, letting the silence hang on the open channel. The Vrax touched something that wasn't theirs. They are now extinct. If you want to wage war on the helpless, do it quietly. Because if we hear you, we will come. End transmission, Cole ordered. Atticus cut the feed. He slumped back in his chair, feeling the deep, mechanical rumble of the slipspace drives building in the deck plates. Humanity had spent 80 years pretending to be asleep, hiding their heavy, ugly nature behind closed borders. Today, they had ripped the mask off. They had stepped onto the galactic stage, not as diplomats, not as explorers, but as the universe's most efficient apex predators. They weren't elegant. They weren't advanced. They were a sledgehammer in a galaxy of glass. Space tore open outside the viewport, a violent, jagged rip in the fabric of reality. The Bellerophon plunged into the breach, dragging the surviving Kalen into the dark with them. Atticus closed his eyes, the smell of alien blood still clinging to his uniform. He knew the peace was over. The SOS hadn't just awoken a fleet. It had awoken a nature humanity had tried desperately to forget. The graveyard shift was over. The galaxy was going to learn to fear the dark, all over again. Humanity finally woke up, and the galaxy will never be the same. If you felt the rumble of the Terran dreadnoughts and loved this brutal awakening, hit that like button and share this story with your fellow Deathworlders. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next dive into the dark forest of the HFY universe. Leave a comment below. Did the Terran fleet go too far, or did the Vrax get exactly what they deserved?